Most people think that what's holding them back is their mind, their negative thoughts, doubts, fears, or mental noise. So naturally, the first instinct is to try and fix the thoughts, replace them with better ones, drown them out with affirmations, force positivity. But here's what most don't realize. Thoughts are not the root cause. They are just surface-level expressions of something much deeper. They're like waves on an ocean. What really shapes the course of life is the tide underneath, and that tide is the state of being. It's the identity that is being lived from, even if it's not consciously chosen. The law doesn't respond to what's being said in the mind for a few minutes. It responds to who is being assumed as real all day long. That's what's reflected back. Not the temporary thoughts, but the consistent state. That's why people get frustrated when they think positively but nothing changes. Because deep down, they still feel like the same person who lacks, who waits, who hopes but doesn't really believe. The reality doesn't change because the self hasn't changed. Trying to force thoughts to be different is like trying to stop the ocean with your hands. It's a losing battle. And it creates a loop of failure and guilt because the thoughts always come back. But when the identity shifts, the thoughts naturally begin to change on their own. It's not effortful anymore. The new self doesn't produce the same mental noise. It doesn't need to. The inner talk softens. The fear loses its grip. The doubts stop making sense. And this is the turning point, when the focus moves from managing thoughts to embodying a new self. A self that already knows it's safe, worthy, and whole. A self that doesn't need to prove anything to receive. A self that doesn't fight the mind, because the mind isn't the source anymore. It becomes background noise, not a battlefield. The real breakthrough happens not when the mind is mastered, but when the identity is transformed, because thoughts follow state, not the other way around. And once the state changes, once the new self is accepted and lived from, the entire inner landscape begins to shift. The thoughts that used to dominate begin to fade, not because they were forced out, but because they no longer belong. There's a trap that many fall into, and it's one of the most exhausting cycles to be stuck in. It's the belief that in order to feel better, life has to be filled with positive thoughts. So every time a fear comes up, the response is to fight it. Every time doubt whispers, it's met with resistance. Every uncomfortable feeling is seen as something wrong that needs to be fixed immediately. But this never-ending mental battle doesn't bring freedom, it brings more stress. And it keeps the focus locked on the surface, while the real cause stays untouched. Thoughts are not random. They don't just float into awareness for no reason. They come from a place, a deeper self, a state. So when fearful or negative thoughts arise, it's not the mind being chaotic. It's the identity being consistent. That means every time the same thought comes back, it's not because the thought is too strong, it's because the self that created it is still alive. And no matter how hard someone tries to override it, it won't stop until the identity changes. That's the part most people miss. The need to control the mind is actually a symptom of being in the wrong state. It's a signal that the inner self is out of alignment with truth. If someone is truly grounded in the state of already having, already being, already knowing, there's no desperation to clean up every single thought. There's peace, there's stillness. The thoughts may still appear, but they don't carry weight anymore. They're like passing clouds, not storms that need shelter. So managing the mind becomes a full-time job only when the identity underneath is still operating from fear. Once the self shifts, the urgency to fix thoughts disappears, because there's no longer anything to fix. The mind doesn't need to be perfect. It just needs to reflect a new truth. And that truth only becomes real when the self is changed, not when the thoughts are silenced. Freedom begins when the focus is taken off controlling the mind and placed on embodying the version of self that doesn't live in fear. The one that doesn't need to be on guard. The one that trusts its own power. That's when everything begins to change. Not because the mind has been fixed, but because it no longer runs the show. Most of the pain isn't coming from what's happening now. It's coming from an old identity that hasn't been updated. A version of self that was created during hard times. A self that made sense back then, when fear was necessary for survival, when love was uncertain, when dreams felt far away. That version still lives, even now, long after the situation has changed. And because it still lives, it keeps creating the same thoughts, same patterns, same stuckness. This old identity becomes so familiar that it starts to feel like the truth. But it's not the truth. It's just repetition. It's just a habit that hasn't been interrupted. And until it's let go of, it will keep creating the same results. It will keep generating the same mental storms. Because the mind can't help but echo the state that is most deeply believed. This is why positive thinking fails for so many. Because they're trying to think from a new place while still being loyal to the old self. It's like wearing a new outfit but still believing the old identity is underneath. It doesn't matter what's said. What matters is what's assumed as real. And if the assumption is still rooted in the story of not enough, not worthy, not safe, then no amount of thought control will bring change. Letting go of this identity doesn't mean rejecting the past. It means recognizing that the self who was afraid no longer needs to be in charge. It means thanking that version, but no longer giving it the steering wheel. The new self, the one aligned with love, peace, and power, must be chosen consciously again and again until it becomes natural. The moment that happens, the thoughts begin to shift, the patterns begin to break, and the life that once felt unreachable starts moving closer, not because anything outside changed first, but because the one within finally did. Every thought that keeps repeating itself isn't just a mental glitch, it's a reflection of the self that's being lived from. And most of those thoughts aren't new. They're echoes from an older version of self, a self that had to protect itself, a self that thought staying small was safer than being seen, a self that didn't know it had the power to choose something different. That's where those thoughts came from. And that's why trying to fix them doesn't really work, because they're not the problem. They're a signal. Trying to fight thoughts is like arguing with smoke and ignoring the fire. The thoughts are not the fire. They're the smoke rising from an inner belief that's still alive. But here's what changes everything. When you stop trying to fix the smoke, and instead, you put out the fire by choosing a new identity. Not just a new thought, but a whole new self. One that doesn't generate those thoughts anymore because it no longer needs them. That's what real healing looks like. Not perfection, not silence, but rising above the old voice until it becomes irrelevant. When a new state is truly lived from, the thoughts that used to feel so loud start to lose their grip, not because they disappeared, but because they no longer make sense. The old voice says, "You're not enough," but the new self doesn't even hear it, it just keeps walking. The old fear whispers, "It's not working," but the new self smiles and stays unmoved, because it's not just a different thought, it's a different self, one that is no longer available for that old reality. And this is why Neville's teachings are so profound. He wasn't telling people to repeat words mindlessly. He was telling them to change their conception of self, to assume a new identity so deeply that the world had no choice but to rearrange itself. Because when the state changes, everything changes. The thoughts, the emotions, the body, the relationships, the outcomes, all of it starts aligning with who you are now. You don't need to silence your mind to be free. You just need to stop identifying with the voice that keeps trying to scare you. And once you do that, once you fully live from the state that already knows, it all starts to feel easy. Not because the path is without challenge, but because the self walking it is no longer afraid. The law doesn't need convincing. It doesn't require a perfect record of thoughts or a flawless mindset. It only ever responds to one thing: identity. Who you are being right now. Not what you hope for, not what you wish to believe, but what you are embodying consistently. That's what gets mirrored back. The world is just playing out the script written by your dominant state of being. So if the inner identity is still saying, "It's not possible for me," then no matter how many positive statements are said, nothing shifts, because the deeper self hasn't moved. The law isn't responding to the noise, it's responding to the tone, the essence, the assumption. That's why so many feel stuck even while doing all the right things, because they're still being the same person, just with a new mask on. And the law can't be fooled. It only reflects what's real on the inside. But here's what changes everything. When the new identity is no longer treated like a place to visit, but like the only place you live. When it's not just a visualization technique or a 5-minute routine, but the ground you walk on all day long. When you say, "I am," and actually mean it, that's when the shift becomes permanent. That's when the law starts rearranging everything. Not because you forced it, but because it had no other option. Assuming a new self is not pretending. It's not acting. It's a decision, a deep, quiet commitment to no longer feed the old story, even when it tries to come back. And it will try, but you don't have to listen. You don't have to answer. You just keep being the version of yourself that already has what you desire. The one who knows. The one who lives from peace, not need. That's the version the law listens to. Not the one who's still begging for signs or watching the clock. The one who knows it's done. That's the version that moves mountains. That's the self that brings change, not through force, but through being. That's the power you were born with, not the ability to think your way there, but to be there. Everything begins and ends with identity. The old thoughts, the stuck patterns, the fears that won't leave, none of it is the core problem. The real issue is the version of self that's still being chosen, often without even realizing it. But that version doesn't have to be carried anymore. It's not the truth. It's just the past, playing itself out on repeat. Now is the time to let it go. Not by fighting it, not by fixing every thought, but by no longer giving it power. The old self only lives when it's fed, so stop feeding it. Starve it by no longer agreeing with its stories. Stop explaining why life has been hard. Start deciding who you are now. A new self is already waiting. One that doesn't chase, one that doesn't fear, one that doesn't explain or justify, just lives, confidently, freely, with peace that doesn't need proof. If you're ready to live from that version of self, drop a comment and say, "I'm no longer the old self." Let it be your declaration. Let it be the moment you mark your transformation. Because the law is always listening, not to your mind, but to your identity. Assume wisely, live fully. You're already new. Let the old self go.